Some of you may remember from a notice in the New York Times in 2001 when Marcello Simonetta, who was then a professor at Wesleyan, discovered an encrypted document in an Italian archive. More importantly, because of course an encrypted document, it doesn't do one any good unless one can read it, he found the book that enabled him to decode the document. And it was a letter that implicated in an absolutely riveting fashion Federico de Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino, the creator of the Gubbio Studiolo in this museum, in the conspiracy to murder the two Medici brothers, Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici. I think probably a good number of you, possibly all of you, know that the plot was only half successful. It took place in the Cathedral of Florence in April of 1478. Giuliano was killed. Lorenzo managed to escape and set about to set the scores right. Marcello had a vested interest because the letter was addressed to one of his ancestors, Chico Simonetta, an advisor at the Sforza court of Milan, and he plays a large part in Marcello's book. Now, all of us have this wonderful idea of the Medici as patrons of the arts, of this great moment of enlightenment in Florence. And of course, Lorenzo was himself a poet as well, and I thought it was fitting just to open up with some little parts of a longer poem that he wrote to set the stage for, inappositely, for what took place thereafter. Into a little close of mine I went one morning when the sun, with his fresh light, was rising, all refulgent and unshent. Then he jumps all the way to the end, I am. Soon autumn comes, and the ripe, ruddy freight is gathered. The glad season will not stay. Flowers, fruit, and leaves are now all desolate. Pluck the rose, therefore, maiden, while 'tis May. Lorenzo plucked maidens, but he plucked men too, and he made them suffer. There was a vindictiveness that is shocking to modern taste and eyes. And we now have 2 books about this that have come out recently. If what you are interested in is violence of an order that will leave you practically numb, I recommend Lauro Martinez's April Blood, and it will take you through the whole realm of Renaissance vengeance, and you will discover ways of doing away with the person that you thought impossible. I thought, Quentin Tarantino could not make a movie of this because it would be way, way beyond the pale, and I consider him way beyond the pale anyway. If, on the other hand, you're interested in the intrigues of the whole conspiracy, try Marcello's book. And it takes you right inside the correspondence going between these peoples as they gather up the energy for this unsuccessful plot. Of course, remember that the plot backfired. And it didn't backfire only because Lorenzo came back, but because he comes back stronger, and it really is the prelude to Florence losing all of its freedom and turning into a Medici dukedom, which is what you remember they tried a second time to get rid of the Medici in 1494, after Lorenzo's death. They expulsed the Medici, and the Medici come back with greater power than ever. Well, Marcello did his undergraduate work in Rome at the University of La Sapienza. He got his doctorate at Yale. And in addition to teaching at Wesleyan, he served as the cultural director and advisor to the American Board of the Foundation of Art and Culture. Some of you may have seen the exhibition he organized on Federico de Montefeltro in his library at the Morgan Library. It was a beautiful little exhibition with marvelous manuscripts and the great portrait of Federico and his son Guidobaldo. And in addition, he has been the editor of a number of important publications, including one that's particularly close to my heart and very different from the Medici, which is the Commentaries of Pius II, the great Sienese humanist. And when you read, this is Pius's own autobiography, and it takes you into another side of the Renaissance world of learning and of culture, and is really a marvelous thing. And with that, I think we'll turn it over to Marcello. Marcello.
Thank you very much, Keith, for your very warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. It's a very cozy, intimate room. I can hear the cell phones ringing already, so it's a good sign. Keith has done a very nice job introducing me, introducing also the topic. So I will try to jump into it rather quickly, and then I hope we have some time to chat at the end of this talk. Also, for who is interested, we might even go up to the Studiolo, take a look afterwards. So, the Gubbio Studiolo. I consider the book Gubbio Studiolo one of the best kept secrets of the Metropolitan Museum. This gorgeous inlaid wood paneled room often escapes the attention of visitors who don't dare to take an extra turn, overwhelmed by the monumental and solemn beauty of the recently and stunningly renovated medieval art wing. I'm not sure how many of you have spent more than 3 minutes in the Studiolo. I'll force you tonight to spend a bit more time in this fantastic room. I also have a very strong personal connection to the Studiolo because when I started writing my book, The Montefeltro Conspiracy, I came often to this room and spent some time in it. I use the space as a sort of a time-traveling machine. In fact, the first chapter that I wrote, which is now chapter 3 of my book, was set in the Gubbio Studiolo precisely on July 2nd, 1477. On that day, the lord of the Studiolo, Federico de Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, dictated a mafia-style threatening letter to be encoded and sent to my ancestor Chico Simonetta, the Chancellor of the Sforza Dukes of Milan. Don't worry, you don't need to have read the book to be here tonight. If you already have, I hope you will be able to learn more about the art and history of this period. But if you haven't, I hope you'll be able to understand what I'm going to say, and also maybe you will want to read the book. So, when I spent my dreamy half hours traveling through centuries and trying to imagine how it was like to be in that room on a summer in 1477, I noticed that the average visitor spent no more than 1 to 2 minutes in this room, hardly looking at the amazing trompe-l'oeil panels, and at the most uttering an occasional "wow" when they actually came closer and watched the minutely and obsessively illusionistic details of the panels. So my aim tonight is to go a bit deeper in the perception and the understanding of this beautiful room. Now, first of all, how on earth did the Studiolo get to the Met? This is quite an extraordinary story, which I'll tell you very quickly. But if you're interested in more details, you should read the fabulous 2-set volume by Olga Raggio, who, this is my book in Brazilian, you can forget about that. Work by Olga Raggio, who was the former chairman of the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Met, and today's lecture is actually dedicated to her memory. So after the death of the last Duke of Urbino in 1631, the Montefeltro and the Rovere Duchy was devolved to the church and steadily declined to the point that all its treasures were seized or sold. The famous library of illuminated manuscripts, the crown of Federico's humanist reputation, was forcibly transferred to the Vatican Library, whereas the Gubbio Studiolo was sold to the Roman prince Filippo Massimo Lancellotti, and he was installed in his Piccolomini villa at Frascati, south of Rome, in the mid-1870s. Now let's fast forward to the 1930s, when Adolf Loewy, international art dealer and also interior decorator, set up his prestigious firm in Venice at the Fondamenta Malcanton. The grandchildren of Prince Lancellotti sold the intarsia to Loewi, and in mid-January 1938, the crates containing the panels, the letter frieze, and the two-part ceiling were shipped from Frascati to Venice. Now, these were not easy times for anyone, but especially for a Jewish art dealer. And tonight is Rosh Hashanah, so Shana Tovatu, who believes in the Jewish tradition. Loewi was a good businessman and a smart man. Only a few weeks after receiving the crates in March 1938, he traveled to Turin to meet one of his best clients, the Swiss silk manufacturer and collector Werner Abegg. On September 21, 1938, Abegg received a full set of photographs of the Studiolo panels and expressed his strong interest in buying it in order to decorate his castle in Germany. On September 25, Loewi wrote to Abegg from Lausanne that the Gubbio woodwork had been disassembled and stored under Abegg's name, prudently, at an Italian shipping company. Loewi asked Abegg to send $15,000 under his name to New York, where he was planning to relocate. In the meantime, the Italian police raided Loewi's Venetian office, so just in time, claiming that he had been engaged in illegal currency transactions, but in fact cracking down on a Jewish foreign national now that the racial laws also in Italy were in place. On February 1st, 1939, the Loewi family sailed from the Dutch port of Le Havre, arriving in New York on February 9. Since Abegg had backed down from his initial offer to own a share of the Studiolo, Loewi asked the Italian director of his firm, whom he had left in charge in Venice to ship the Studiolo crates, via Marseille. By May 15, the panels were safely delivered at the Tomich workshop on 1554 3rd Avenue between 87th and 88th Street. At that point, Loewi engaged in an intense negotiation with the Metropolitan Museum that was only a few blocks away from his storage. And by November 30th, 1939, the panels belonged officially to the Met. The installation of the Gubbio Studiolo was a complicated and lengthy operation. It lasted almost 26 years, from 1941 to 1967. And then the restoration took almost another 20 years, and it was done under the expert supervision of Olga Raggio. So, just 1 week ago, the city of Gubbio inaugurated a handmade replica of the Gubbio Studiolo, and it was produced for an undisclosed budget, but my informants tell me it cost almost 2 million euros. Interestingly, in the Italian papers, Mr. Loewi's story was passed completely under silence and referred to, I quote, many vicissitudes. So this is the new kind of PC in the post-fascist Italian era, which we hope will end soon. Okay, having said that, I'm sure you understand I'm more than happy to move from the miseries of the present to the glories of the past. Now, I want to give you a quick geographical context here, and I am showing you the map of Italy, which actually was on display at the little show that Keith has mentioned. It's a map of Italy, which is part of a Ptolemy series of maps and descriptions of countries and cities, and was made in the workshop of the famous bookmaker Vespasiano da Bisticci. Mind you, the theme of Florence runs through this whole talk, but I'm trying to focus more on Montefeltro than the Medici in this first part. So, we're going to be visiting, of course, Urbino, because that's the source of every single thing that Federico does, as well as Gubbio, which is here is indicated with its old Latin name. Then we're going to go to Florence, and we'll also take a little trip to Volterra, and then to Rome. So my little tour will end in the Eternal City, where I actually am from. So, Gubbio. Gubbio is a beautiful medieval town strategically located on the slope of a steep hill about 50 miles south of Urbino, then the capital of the Montefeltro territory. Federico de Montefeltro was born in Gubbio in 1422, bastard son of the local lord Guidantonio. Federico's refined taste in art and culture was the result of his excellent education. As a teenager, Federico went to one of the best schools, the Yale of the Renaissance, also known as the Ca' Gioiosa, the Joyous House, an elite institution just outside of Mantua. Other students included the future Marquis of Mantua, Ludovico Gonzaga. Classical authors from Greek and Latin antiquity were taught by the famous humanist Vittorino da Feltre. There was also serious martial and athletic training, and it is no surprise that Federico took seriously the education of his son, who embodied the living hope of survival for the long-term plans of his duchy. He also hired the best teachers and bought the best books available, or actually commissioning them, as you will see very soon. Federico's son was also born in Gubbio in January 1472, so exactly 50 years later. And this was not the first son, but the actual only son that survived him. So, in their native town, Federico refurbished a palace in which he commissioned a studiolo, and the Gubbio Studiolo mirrored the one built earlier in Urbino. In the summer of 2007, I had the pleasure of curating a little show at the Morgan Library entitled Federico de Montefeltro and His Library. With the help of my friend photographer and bibliophile Fabrizio Fenucci, who is here and came from Italy for this lecture, and I'm grateful for that, we reconstructed the Urbino Studiolo using high-resolution digital pictures. We also brought this work of art that Keith has already mentioned, this double portrait, which I could entertain you about for a long time, but I'm not tonight. Yes?
Hi, I was told that you need to back off from the microphone a little bit.
Oh. Is it better like this?
Yes.
Oh, you should have told me before. All right, should I start again? Well, let's pretend that you understood what I said before. All right, so the result was quite stunning, the result of this digital reconstruction. And the Urbino Studiolo sort of came alive in the cube built by Renzo Piano in the new Morgan Library. Many people thought, in fact, that we had brought the actual panels, the wood panels, from Italy, and were scratching the walls to check. So for a couple of months, my favorite boasting line was that while the two studioli used to be 50 miles away from each other, they were now only 50 blocks away. Whoever had the chance to visit them both at that time, at the Morgan and here at the Met, probably could gauge the similarities and differences. In both of his studioli, and this is called the Gubbio Studiolo, Federico de Montefeltro could gaze upon the surrounding walls of the room, trompe-l'oeil images in the most elaborate inlay wood of objects that looked so real one could have reached them and touched them. Shelves, books on lecterns or open, musical and scientific instruments, weapons and pieces of armor, all arranged in a sort of casually and disorderly fashion. These were the objects that befitted humanist soldier Federico when he needed solitude and contemplation. Now, many of you, I'm sure, are aware of the distinction that was so crucial in the life of the Renaissance, which was between the vita activa and the vita contemplativa, the two lives. The two kinds of lives that one needs to be a complete man. And obviously Federico was a champion in both of them. And we'll return to this concept very soon. So, in the Urbino Studiolo, the ornamented female body, and this is, the ornamented is nowhere in sight. Three women of pious demeanor appear in monochrome. This is one of them, Charity. And in fact, it's very difficult to speak about a three-dimensional space on a flat screen. So from now on, you will have to bear with me a little. I'll try to do my best to give you a sense of the three-dimensionality of the space, but then luckily we only have to walk a few steps upstairs to look at it again. Botticelli is in the subtitle of my talk, but in fact there is no proof whatsoever that he was involved in any of the making of this Studioli. Certainly his hand was not directly involved, although his style and his influence was probably, and you can probably see it somehow in this female figure. Now obviously this is not, I emphasize, as appealing as the ultra-famous Venus born out of the sea that Botticelli painted. And in fact, these Studioli are a heavily male realm. The portrait of Federico, dressed in a white Roman tunic, is also in the Urbino Studiolo. And he is shown holding a spear down, recalling the image of Mars, the god of war, in the guise of the peace seeker, as often portrayed on ancient Roman coins. Also possibly, as I've been instructed lately, could be also the dress of the member of the exclusive order of the Ermine that was awarded to him by the King of Naples. On top of the Studiolo, and here you can see this is Charity, this is the little portrait of Federico. There are portraits of 28 great illustrious men. So, as I say, very male-oriented. The Gubbio Studiolo, despite today's relatively sober and stern appearance, used to be much more of a feminine space, in fact. You can see that there is a lettering going around this Urbino Studiolo as well, and you can see it even better, as there is in the Gubbio Studiolo. This gold lettering, possibly dictated in Latin by Federico himself, although he had an army of humanists and poets that were serving him, but he liked to attribute to himself a few fancy quotes. So this gold lettering runs along the top of the Studiolo's paneling, and you can see it upstairs, and reads as follows. You see how the eternal students of the Venerable Mother, men exalted in learning and in genius, fall forward in supplication with bare head and bended knee. Now, who is the Venerable Mother? And who are the women to whom this man, very important man, go and kneel in front, not beheaded, we'll talk about beheading later, bareheaded. Well, the Venerable Mother happens to be Mnemosyne, also known as the goddess of memory. And she is the mother of all the liberal arts, which you see here reunited in the page. Now, the parentheses refer to the fact that the paintings, unfortunately, are either missing or have been destroyed. The Berlin paintings, Dialectic and Astronomy, on which I'm actually going to focus in the next few seconds, were destroyed in Berlin just a couple of years under the bombs of the Allies, as you can imagine, just a couple of years after the Studiolo was actually saved on this side of the pond. So what's left actually is only the two panels in London, which I'll mention later. So these are the two Berlin panels. And so the painting of the several liberal arts encircle the upper walls in an encyclopedic homage to the Duke's erudition. Each of the arts, embodying by an allegorical female figure, handed her precious gifts to a powerful, bareheaded male figure, as you can see here. So you have Federico, and this is Ferrante of Aragon, his employer and friend, not as sculptor as he was, in fact. So from the corner of his left eye, as you probably know, Federico was deprived of his right eye in a joust, not in battle, but in a sort of a game. So from the corner of his left eye, Federico could catch a glimpse of his own portrait, in which he was shown kneeling, his red felt hat resting on the elegant carpeted steps. Just above him, in the picture, a shield with a Montefeltro coat of arms. You can see it here. Held by the imperious Montefeltro eagle, surmounted a metal sconce. To the right of the figure, a painted window frame opened onto a room with an open door, the traditional symbol of the gateway to knowledge. Federico is seen being offered a thick volume by a woman, the allegorical figure of dialectic, one of the liberal arts. Dialectic or logic is the queen of the trivium, which lays the foundation of language and thought, along grammar and rhetoric. The two sisters' liberal arts that pertain to language. The book Federico receives has a golden clasp and is decorated with an image of the nude Hercules. And this depiction emphasizes the strength of his logical reasoning and the stringency of his mental acuity as much as of his military action. So let's take a look at the courtyard of the Urbino Palace, that goes without saying is much fancier than the Gubbio Palace. You can see that there are two sets of friezes that run across this square courtyard. The same principle, I believe, applies also to the Studiolo, not only in the frieze, which you already saw. This is the frieze. But in fact, also on top of each of the paintings. And we have some fragments of these original frieze that compose this writing that you can barely read, but don't worry, we'll get to read it very soon. So I'm going to do a little bit of magic here. The reconstruction of Studiolo, this is the one that's been proposed by several scholars, including Olga Raggio, and I'm not convinced by it for a very simple reason, that, as you can see, this is the west wall, this is the north wall, and this is the south wall. But if you go upstairs, you'll notice immediately that these are interrupted by the east wall, which actually occupies the windows. So in order to have this disposition, you would have an interruption in the frieze, and the frieze would read funnily. So let me do my magic. Let's put this here, put this here, put this here, da-da-da, da-da-da, and here is the Studiolo as it should be. So if you go to the Studiolo, you have to try to picture these large paintings, very colorful, although here for good reasons I just did it in black and white, and that made the room much more interesting and symbolically charged. It looks a bit funny to have that white wall on top of the panels. And who knows, maybe one day we will be able to reconstruct the full Studiolo. Unfortunately, the three panels that are lost, we don't even know how they look like. For all we know, they could be sitting in some living room in Pescara or, in, I don't know, Göttingen. Everything is possible. But certainly the two ones that exist in London belong to the Studiolo, and some scholars disagree with that, but I definitely don't think this is the case. So I sort of set up the space, and I hope you can picture it in its original richness. And I shouldn't forget to mention the ceiling, which is a gorgeous original piece, and not many people distracted by the beauty of the panels actually bother to look up, but next time you go, please do, because it's an extraordinary work of decoration and gold freezing. So back to the Studiolo. When and where was the Studiolo made? The only firm document we can rely on is a contract dated May 22nd, 1477, which commissioned the gold letter frieze, which means that the construction must have been well underway by then. Perhaps it took longer than expected. Delays, as we know, are part of any real estate enterprise. And personally, having been recently subjected to the painful rite of passage called gut renovation in a New York City apartment, I know the feeling very well. However, the client being the most demanding and generous, but also most unforgiving employer and patron of arts of the time, and not just a poor intellectual like me, I would have not have wanted to be late if I were the contractor of Federico da Montefeltro, if you know what I mean. So in this contract, the contractor is actually the Sienese architect and multitasking artist Francesco di Giorgio, a true Renaissance man and a sort of Leonardo da Vinci lookalike, whom Federico employed both as a military engineer to build weapons and fortresses and as a refined decorator. The painter on the frieze, so the golden lettering, was assigned to a not very well known, maybe Keith knows him, but he's the only one, Berardino di Nanni Pietro. So let's turn to the more visual parts of this talk, giving you a lot of facts and dates and names. I want to just now turn more to the visual. First of all, I'm going to be focusing just for the sake of time on a couple of objects that you see. I could do it for pretty much every object in the Studiolo, but we would run out of time very quickly. So just keep in mind these two, the sphere on the right and the lectern with a book on the left. Now, in terms of visual models, the Studiolo has a long and very interesting tradition. And this painting was probably the inspiration for many Studioli, including Federico's one. This painting happened to be part of Lorenzo de' Medici's personal collection. It came from his father's collection, Piero's collection. And I think it's pretty safe to assume that Botticelli was influenced by it when he painted this fresco in the Church of Ognissanti, portraying St. Augustine. Now, you immediately see the armillary sphere, the classic astronomical and geometrical device used to measure the stars, but also earthly and military artifacts such as towers and moats, as illustrated in Roberto Valturio's book of arms. Here, where is it? So these are other examples, of the armillary sphere. This is a father of the church, and look at the beauty of this manuscript made for Federico with a little perspective. And all the objects here, we could spend a lot of time looking at them, but no, we're not going to do it today. So this is Roberto Valturio's book of military art. And as I said, the armillary sphere could be used for both things. So we're approaching more the visual, but also the exciting part of the talk, I hope, which is the part in which I try to connect the Medici and Federico in ways that I haven't done in the book. First of all, let me give you a little bit of background history here. The relationship between Federico da Montefeltro and Lorenzo de' Medici started early on. His senior by almost 30 years, Federico was hired by Lorenzo in 1472 to crush the rebellion of the city of Volterra. The fearful mercenary fulfilled the mission and besieging and sacking savagely the city. He also took some time pillaging the private library of a Jewish merchant called Menachem Ben Aron and taking all of his books in his Hebrew collection. So he sort of did a lot of shopping while I was doing this. So Lorenzo ordered, we are still in 1472, ordered lavish celebrations in Florence to honor Federico's deed. The condottiere was welcomed triumphantly to the city in the manner of an ancient Roman hero. He received banners embroidered with his coat of arms, along with splendid textiles wrought with gold. He was granted Florentine citizenship and was promised a glorious silver-gilt helmet embellished with animal and a figure of Hercules subduing a griffin, which was the symbol of the city of Volterra that he had pretty much wiped out. A few months later, along with the helmet, Federico received a highly precious, beautifully illuminated codex. This codex was Cristoforo Landino's Disputationes Camaldulenses. In the preface of this work, Federico was celebrated as the supreme champion of both the contemplative and the active life, the master of war who aimed for peace. Upon receiving this magnificent manuscript, Federico wrote a letter politely thanking both Landino and, sort of dismissively, in a somewhat patronizing and condescending way, Lorenzo, the most skilled young man, whom he embraced as a son with particular benevolence and as a brother with honor. Lorenzo himself appeared as one of the speakers in Landino's dialogue, championing action over contemplation, and chose none other than Federico as a model. We're still in the fictionalized dialogue of Landino's work. These are the laudatory words on statesmanship uttered by the fictional Florentine friend Lorenzo. In our times, we have Federico de Montefeltro, Prince of Urbino, whom I doubtlessly consider worth comparing to the best captains of the ancient era. Many and most admirable are the virtues of such an excellent man. His penetrating wit is passionate about everything. He gives himself the leisure and the company of the most erudite and cultivated men, while reading many books, listening to many disputes, participating in many debates, as well as being a man of letters in his own right. We actually don't have any real work by Federico, but it's okay, a bit of flattery. However, if he had allowed his speculations to replace the vigilant hold on his state and the strong hand on his soldiers, he would have been reduced to nothing. So I won't go into the detailed and complex relationship of the two, because that's what I wrote about in my book. What I want to talk about instead, briefly, is a new thing that happened over the summer, and believe it or not, thanks to Facebook. I'm part of a small fan group for Federico de Montefeltro, Duca di Urbino. Yes. And believe it or not, some interesting things happen on Facebook. And what happened here? Come on. What happened was that suddenly I was sent over Facebook this letter. Now, this is an unpublished letter that is preserved in the Gubbio archive. So that seemed to be the sort of godsend for this talk. And it happens to be the same exact code that was used in the letter that I talk about in the book that reveals the nasty background of the Pazzi conspiracy. This one is slightly less nasty, slightly. But it's very interesting to see that the same exact code was used among the three men that were the closest to Federico, and they were communicating about basically controlling the whole of Italy. This letter happens to be sent to a man called Giovan Battista Mellini, who was in Naples, serving for Federico and for Ferrante, the king you met before, kneeling in front of the allegorical liberal art. And it talks about a lot of things. We don't need to get into details. I will publish this letter soon, although I haven't decided where yet. And it does sort of introduce us to the nasty world of what I call the Montefeltro conspiracy. I'm happy to answer questions about this later on as well, but I just wanted to show you the Urbino Codex that contains some, not all, some of the symbols, especially the ones referring to people or powers that actually recur in both of the letters, the Ubaldini letter that I published in the book and in this new newly surfaced letter. And as Keith has mentioned, my ancestor Chico Simonetta happened to be involved in these matters pretty intensely. But it's not about him that I want to talk about, it's about this guy that you know very well. This is a bust portraying Lorenzo de Medici, the Magnificent. In fact, I should be showing you this because this is how he looks like, because it had been painted over, but originally it was a polychrome bust that is now preserved at the National Gallery in Washington. I'm going to skip over quickly here, showing just the cast of characters. This is also a bust, beautiful bust of Giuliano, the younger brother, who unfortunately gets killed in the conspiracy. He looks very cocky here, doesn't he? And it didn't last very long, this cockiness, unfortunately. And then we have another Botticelli painting, the famous Adoration of the Magi. This is the 1471, in which both Lorenzo and Giuliano are portrayed, along with Botticelli himself, who, in the typical fashion of the self-portrait of an artist in the painting, is looking at us and sort of inviting us inside of this frame. Today I heard another lecture by someone else talking about the Adoration of the Magi, not this one, but the next one that Botticelli did in 1480, that was acquired by Andrew Mellon in 1931. Guess what? From the Hermitage Museum. And Andrew Mellon paid a lot of money to get it from the Russians, and sort of paid this money also because he wanted to show how great he was against the Soviets. But this one instead is more interesting because it shows how close the Botticelli was to the family. He in fact puts himself in a pretty prominent position near the kneeling Medici, or the bending Medici, in front of the Virgin Mary and the newly born Jesus baby. So here is our friend Botticelli looking at us pretty intensely. Now, as I try to say in my book, I think that Botticelli was one of the most mischievous artists ever. And we have several testimonies about this that we read, for instance, in Vasari. Vasari details all the terrible practical jokes that he would play on his colleagues and friends. Skimming through quickly through what happens after the Pazzi conspiracy, this is the famous Pazzi medal. It portrays it, as you can see, it's a mirror image of the two brothers, and you have on both sides, the two sides of the Duomo. Sorry, I went too fast. And you see the two lecterns, which of course hold the Bible or whatever book they're reading in church. And you can see the two mirror images. On the one end, you have Lorenzo, who represents the public safety, and he survived the attack. And on the other end, unfortunately, you have Giuliano, who represents the public mourning, and he died. And they both are made into this huge sort of Botticelli-like angels that dwarf the little figures of these petty conspirators. Now, as Keith has mentioned before, in the aftermath of this bloody conspiracy, almost all of the conspirators were killed in several interesting ways. Some of them were thrown out of the higher windows of the Palazzo Vecchio, or Palazzo della Signoria. Some of them were first gutted and then hanged. Some of them were, various combinations of these things anyway. We don't need to get into too many gory details tonight. It's Friday night. But what I really want to talk about here is this drawing, which I talk about in the book, about which a new idea sort of arose in my mind while I was writing this lecture. And this is a famous sketch, and it's done by the very young Leonardo, who at the time was not nearly as famous as Botticelli. And Leonardo drew him, drew this man who was the actual killer of Giuliano de' Medici. He drew him dressed as a Turk in mockery of him. Why as a Turk? Not because he wanted to make any anti-Muslim jokes, but because in fact he had tried to find escape in Istanbul or Constantinople and had been sent back by the Sultan, who was a good friend of Lorenzo, and said, "Oh, look who I have here. I'm going to send it back to you. Take care of him, good care of him." So this is a famous sketch, as I say, and you probably can see that this is the writing, typical writing of Leonardo. It's not encoded, it's simply the mirror writing that he was practicing normally. And what it does, it describes the colors of the dress, of the Turkish hat and the robe and everything that Bernardo Bandini Baroncelli was wearing at the time of his execution. Now, this is an interesting drawing that in fact was talked about by our friend Keith Christiansen in 1994. He wrote a little note to the editor of the prestigious Burlington magazine because a scholar friend of ours, whom we won't mention because we shouldn't, published this drawing saying that this was a dancing figure. Keith took a good look at the drawing and said, "Well, I don't think so. Try to reverse the drawing and you'll see that something else is going on here." And I cannot reverse the drawing, unfortunately, but I can point you to a little detail that is crucial in this drawing. Now, this drawing, and Keith made the first suggestion in this direction, is definitely connected to the Pazzi conspiracy. So what happened in July of 1478, so just 3 months after the conspiracy itself, after all the deaths had been washed down, literally the waters of the Arno River, the Florentine Signoria charged Botticelli with a large life-size fresco of all the conspirators that had been hanged or variously killed to be painted on the very walls of the Palazzo della Signoria. Now, this is known. We have several testimonies that show us this. We unfortunately don't know how this looked like because, why? Because in 1494, the date that Keith mentioned before, which was the date of the expulsion of the Medici from Florence, at that point Lorenzo had died and his very incapable son Piero really didn't deserve to stay in town much longer. So at that point, part of the natural, spontaneous revolution that followed also destroyed, unfortunately, the paintings that Botticelli had, the frescoes that Botticelli had made on the walls of the Palazzo della Signoria. Now, the idea that came to me is that, in fact, this man should be, of course, one of the conspirators, but which one? In a very thorough and nice volume on Filippino Lippi, a scholar called Jonathan Nelson imagines that this could be a guy called Napoleone Francesi, who was the only one of the whole gang who actually escaped prison or execution in the aftermath of the conspiracy. In fact, what I think it is the portrait of Bernardo Bandini himself before being executed, because being hanged from the foot upside down like a tarot card, that is used for the condemned in absentia. So most likely what happened was that all the killed, the executed, were put in the painting in July 1478 when Botticelli did his fresco. And of course, that was far from the date in which our friend Bernardo was to be caught and sent back to Florence. So he had to finish the fresco, and he put the figure of this guy upside down, hanged from his foot. Then, when Bernardo Bandini was in fact captured and sent back and executed, that fresco became suddenly outdated. So our friend Leonardo certainly did the sketch, but now the question is, did he in fact paint instead of the original Botticelli fresco, this small figure of a hanged man in the actual frescoes on the Palazzo da Signoria? Unfortunately, even if he did, we will never know. But it's a sort of a nice idea to play with. So, let's go back to the Studiolo. What we know for sure is that the war between Florence and Rome lasted between April 1478 and March 1480, but it did not prevent the circulation of deluxe artistic goods commissioned by Federico in Florence, as the second volume of the Montefeltro Bible, which has actually been reproduced and I'm told is the best-selling deluxe book of the Met Shop. So this book was to be the jewel of Federico's sumptuous collection, and the Duke could not bear the thought of losing it to the Florentines. It had been produced, obviously, in the workshop of Vespasiano da Bisticci. So the huge manuscript had been completed on June 12, 1478, so just a few weeks after the Pazzi conspiracy had occurred. The volume was dedicated to the church's commander, I'm quoting, engaged in defending the Christian religion no less than adorning it. Lorenzo, which at the time had been called by the Pope Sixtus IV, who was also behind the conspiracy, as I show in the book without any reasonable doubt, he was called by the same Pope son of iniquity and perdition, and he had been excommunicated and sent to hell preventively. And so you can imagine that Lorenzo, who certainly wasn't deprived of a good sense of humor, appreciated the irony of being able to release the most precious Bible ever made to date to his enemy, Federico de Montefeltro. And of course, he received it, Federico received it very politely and thanked for it. This was on the eve of the war that almost destroyed Lorenzo. Now, so why I mention this? Because the theory about the Gubbio Studiolo is that it was made between 1478 and 1480 by a Florentine workshop, namely the workshop of Giuliano and Benedetto da Maiano. And I'm not going to question the fact that it was most likely produced there and maybe finished later. But I'm pretty sure that by the time that 1477 letter that I wrote you, the contract, and when the frieze was commissioned, the work, as I said, must have been way under completion, because you don't do a frieze before doing the cabinetry. It just makes no sense. Ask any contractor in New York, they will tell you the same. So this is the portrait that Botticelli made of Giuliano de Medici. I've just been told by Keith that this painting will come to New York for a wonderful show on Renaissance Italian portraits to begin at the very end of the year 2011. So you're going to be able to admire it here if you don't go to Washington. And I could tell you a lot about this painting, and one thing is for sure that it was painted after the death of Giuliano, and there are many reasons to think that. But what I really want to talk about here is what happens after in Botticelli's career. This is a part of my book that I'm very proud of, and not many people seem to have read the last part of my book. I noticed that all the reviewers talk about the rest of the book, but not of this, except for the Washington Post. So I want to, in this wonderful room, just to reiterate a couple of points that I tried to make in a sort of quick fashion. So this is the Sistine Chapel as it looked like in the 1480s. And of course, the ceiling was not yet painted by Michelangelo. And the people involved in this enterprise were Perugino, the only non-Florentine painter, and then 3 Florentine artists, Ghirlandaio, Cosimo Rosselli, and Botticelli. As I observed in my book, the artist that the Pope, who was not particularly smart in terms of art. The artist that he most liked was Cosimo Rosselli. Why? Because he used a lot of gold. Let me say a couple words about this pope. This pope was Sixtus IV, and he had been the general of the Franciscan order. When he became pope, he sort of forgot his vow of humility and poverty, and he commissioned this gorgeous monumental chapel, which is called Sistine Chapel, after him. So he had artists decorating both sides, the walls of the chapel. On the one side with the Moses cycle, on the other with the Jesus cycle. So New Testament and Old Testament episodes are sort of put in an interesting parallel, put one in front of the other, and they comment sort of on each other. Now, I want to focus very briefly on one of these paintings, which was by all means painted by our Botticelli. I talk at length about this painting in the last chapter of my book. But there is a little detail that I didn't talk about in the book that I want to just point out to you in a sort of kind of half-jokingly way. Now, you see this little thing on top? Does it look like a smiley to you? It does to me. Well, it's very strange because if you look down in the painting, in the same exact profile of the little smiley, you have this guy and this guy, who are respectively Aaron and Moses, the religious or spiritual and political or military authorities of the Jewish people. And we know that the profile is exactly the same as Sixtus IV. The Pope was asked, the same painter who had painted the condemned complotters against the Medici, who has painted a portrait of Giuliano after he died. So you can imagine how enthusiastic it was to go and work for the guy who had been behind the whole bloodshed, all right? So guess what? He looks exactly like him, except of course for the beard, which is hardly a disguise. And mind you, the little smiley is on top, so nobody can actually see it standing. You try and see it when you go back to the Sistine Chapel. You can't. But it's a kind of detail that the mischievous Botticelli would have put there, just to warn people of what his real intention about this. This is a punishment of the rebels against authority are. So the Florentines had been rebelling against Florence in the papal version because guess what? They didn't let themselves be killed in the main church. And so the Pope excommunicated Lorenzo and the city because they didn't let themselves be killed in the church. And then, as a sort of payoff for the peace agreement they reached, he was sent, Botticelli was sent to paint the same chapel, okay? So now let's take another look at the same painting. This is the face of Korah, the terrible rebel that has made Moses and Aaron so angry, is about to be crushed by and actually sent into fire. Now, let me show this again. This is Korah, and this is someone that you've seen, I'm sure, in a sort of slightly well-known painting called the Primavera, yes? And of course, there are many interpretations of this painting, and I've provided one. I'm not going to repeat it here, but I just want to go to the point that if this is indeed an immortal figure, this may be Athanasia, could be Zephyrus, could be whatever you want it to be, and is literally instilling life into the whole painting, this is indeed a vendetta that Botticelli is privately taking in a painting that is made exclusively for the Medici family, exclusively for their view and for no one else, sort of taking the piss out of the Sistine fresco that he himself has made under the threat of being killed. In fact, Botticelli was never paid for his job in Rome, by the way. So let me just finish by quoting something else. This is unfortunately the only record that we have of what used to be the altarpiece of the Sistine Chapel. And of course, Sixtus IV, the patron of the same chapel, was kneeling there and waiting for the Madonna to go up in the sky. This is an Assunta. Now, it's not there anymore. It used to be here. This was a painting that originally was covering the altarpiece of the most sacred Catholic chapel, okay? This is the chapel where the popes from then on will be elected. And the altarpiece has been destroyed, and the altarpiece used to portray the very pope that commissioned the chapel. What's going on here? Well, first of all, Federico dreamed once to be portrayed on that very altarpiece. We have a letter that I published in my book in which he complains to an ambassador that the Pope's nephew has in fact destroyed the project of having himself, Federico, the captain of the army of the church, to be portrayed on the very altarpiece. So Federico is not there, but neither is Sixtus. And why is that? Well, take a look at this little drawing by Michelangelo. And you see, this is the space. And Michelangelo, in his preparatory sketch, had in fact kept the space for the altarpiece, because obviously there's no way an artist, even as ambitious and as respected as Michelangelo, could dream of destroying an altarpiece. And who is the one who destroyed this altarpiece? I won't tell you. You're going to have to read the book. But I'm going to end on a little different note. And I'm very glad that Keith started this, or actually ended his introduction on a poem. And the poem is actually here. Now, if you go back to the Studiolo, you'll see there's actually there are many scribbles that are made to look as if they were text, but they actually aren't. They're sort of coded. But this is actually a full page from Virgil's Aeneid. And it's from Book 10, and it describes the combat between Turnus and Pallas. And at the end of this combat, which is a very violent combat, Pallas dies, and Virgil comments. Lifetimes are brief and not to be regained for all mankind, but by their deeds to make their fame last. That is labor for the brave. So this becomes Federico's motto after his death. In fact, this little thing here is the symbol of his son Guidobaldo, because this panel was finished after his death. But this on this note that I would like to finish my talk. And of course, I've told you only half of the story, but you can read the other half in the book. Thank you very much.